Well, this is the 1 o'clock presentation on thoughts on CMMC. If you're not in here for that, you can stand up. Nobody will make fun of you as you leave, anything like that. Just kidding. So, yeah, so we're I'm blessed. I've got a couple of colleagues up here. We've done this presentation once before for SAME. You're going to learn there were several changes that recently took place, and we're going to talk about that. Definitely in there. First off, though, some housekeeping notes. Emergency exits in the back. We've silenced our phones. If it does ring, we'll just come out there and answer them for you. So that's it. You are getting 1 credit of PDH for this presentation. And it is being recorded. So if you do have questions and that kind of stuff, we will entertain those. In fact, we've left actually quite a bit of room in the presentation to do so. Please come on up to the microphone, or at least get really a booming voice. We'll repeat the questions for the recording and that as well from there. So, all right. With no further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for Housekeeping for sponsoring this session. So, just by a show of hands, how many of you are academic, nonprofit? Anybody in here from that standpoint? All right. About large businesses, 2,000 and above? Okay, so a couple. And small businesses? Would expect that to be the majority of the room, right? Right. Active duty, we can tell. Thank you. Thank you for your service on that one. How about civilian government agency? Okay. Couple of them. So good mix in here, actually, of everything from there. So, all right. I've asked a couple of you as I was kind of wandering the room and that kind of stuff, where are you at in your CMMC journey? So kind of just by show of hands, how many of you, this is the first time you've really heard of CMMC, NIST 800-171, anything along that lines? Okay, so we'll go through there. From there, how many of you have not even begun anything? You know what it is, you can spell it, but that's about it. There, okay. And how many are pretty far along the way? Like you could pass it right now if the C3PAO came in. So, wow, that's excellent. Excellent. So, any of you want to get up here and teach? No? All right. So, I'm going to start with our prime to my far left-hand side here, Dick Coraluski. Dick is the Federal Regional Manager, Government Services for Power Engineers. They are an engineering and environmental consulting firm. Dick has more than 30 years of experience in the architectural and engineering industry, with more than 20 years in the federal market, supporting projects in the U.S. and overseas. He also serves as the Federal Security Officer, responsible for security on all federal contracts and projects, I'm assuming at Powers, not all of them. And he comes from Boise, Idaho.
Yeah, thanks for that.
To my immediate left, we have Ned Childs. Ned is a partner at McGuireWoods. And Ned's practice spans more than a decade in Washington and encompasses a broad array of legal services, including government contract investigations, disclosures, and regulatory enforcement actions, bid protests and government contract disputes, government contract counseling, export licensing and enforcement, and prime contractor, subcontractor disputes. And Ned is in from Washington, D.C. Myself, Damon Hacker, couldn't have picked a better name for myself if I had tried, given what I do in cybersecurity. So thank you, Mom and Dad, for that. I'm one of the co-founders and president of Vestige Digital Investigations. I've been in the industry for about 20 years or more in terms of cybersecurity and compliance. Really help a lot of companies get certified and get compliant with a bunch of different frameworks. I am actually a registered provider, and we are a registered provider organization under the CMMC accreditation body, part of that ecosystem there, and helping companies get from assessment to remediation and anywhere in between that from there. So, whoops, I forgot to put my fun facts up there. So, all right. So, if anybody's been following anything with the news, we had a fairly significant change that occurred 2 weeks from tomorrow ago. From there, CMMC came out with version 2.0. Anybody hear about it? Know anything about it? Yeah, okay, good. You guys are at least familiar with it. So I'm going to take kind of a little detour and just give about a 3 to 4 minute just overview of what the changes are, and just so we have some kind of perspective as we're talking about some of the things. So I do a lot of the speaking, and a lot of the things that I've always told people is that CMMC is really kind of a replacement, more of like an evolution of NIST 800-171, all right? Nothing could be further from the truth with version 2.0 because some of the changes that have been made have really been to collapse it, make it a little bit more streamlined, and quite frankly, in some situations, to make it a little bit easier from there. Everything we're going to talk about, we'll try to keep it in perspective of 2.0, of CMMC 2.0. There may be something that squeaks in there, and if it does, then we'll kind of come back and say, okay, well, this was under the old 1.0 version of it. The biggest visible changes, I guess I would say, from 1.0 to 2.0 is the first is we went from 5 maturity levels, with 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest, to compacting that to 1, 2, and 3. All right? If you were a 1, you're still a 1. If you were a 3 in the old system, which was the first level you could have controlled unclassified information in, that is now level 2. We just pulled 2 out. Now we're at level 2. If you were at a level 5, that is the new level 3. Okay, so basically they pulled 2 and 4 out of there. 2 we knew was going to go away, or not necessarily go away. We knew there were going to be no contracts at level 2. There was a question about number 4. So it kind of made sense that they did that. Okay, so that's a visible change that clearly they've made. One of the other things that they've done is for all level 1, it's all self-assessment, just like it was under NIST 800-171. The one wrinkle with that is that anything that is quote-unquote self-assessment under the CMMC model really should be said self-attestation, because one of the big things that they're doing is a senior official from the organization, officer, something like that, is going to have to sign off on the fact that the controls are in place and working as designed. I know Ned's going to have a good perspective on that as we go through that. So that's one thing. Probably the most confusing part, I would say, is that level 2 has been kind of split. Not necessarily in half, it's been bifurcated, and there are now prioritized contracts and non-prioritized contracts. If you are a non-prioritized, if you're going for a non-prioritized contract, you do not, you will be a self-attestation organization seeking compliance as well. You will still need to go through the C3PAO process and an outside evidence-based assessment if you are bidding on and want to win a prioritized contract. The only guidance that we've seen or kind of heard so far about a prioritized versus non-prioritized has been if you're receiving CUI and let's say it has something to do with the uniform or something that's not mission critical, that's going to likely be a non-prioritized contract. If it's dealing with weapons, command and control, anything along that lines, it's going to be a prioritized contract from there. And then the last real big visible change is, remember those POAMs, the Plan of Actions and Milestones, that we said they were getting rid of under CMMC? Well, they're back, all right? But there's some caveats with that. First is that they're time-bound, and the rules are looking like right now that it's going to be about 180 days. Okay, so you can't just have a POAM that's out there for, ad infinitum from there. So 180 days is looking like what it's going to be. The other thing is that you're going to have to qualify to have a POAM, meaning that you're going to have a certain score when you do the self-assessment. You have to do a certain score to even qualify to use, to be able to put a POAM together. And then there are going to be some items that are non-addressable via a POAM. I kind of have my thoughts on that. My guess is it's going to be all of the maturity level 1 items, so the 17 controls that are under that, and what I call the big 40. They're the 40 of them that when you go to do your self-assessment, you lose 5 points, 3 points in a couple of them, 5 points if you don't have those in place. Those seem like a pretty good starting point to say, hey, those are probably going to be the ones that are non-addressable. Which kind of means that you're probably going to have somewhere in the ballpark of a 50 to 60 in your SPURS score to be able to qualify for a POAM. And that. There's probably a couple other little things in there that change, but for the most part, that's it. I'm going to leave my comment for the end on that one from there. So, but anyhow, yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to then start from there. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Dick. We've got a couple other questions here that just to kind of set the stage from there. So, yeah, what do you think? Subcontractors need to be compliant with NIST 800-171 and CMC. How many people say no? How many say yes for NIST 800-171? Oh, that's a typo, 171, but not for CMMC. Okay, good guess. What about that last one there? Only if the prime is certified to a maturity level, we'll say 2 or higher. Anybody? So everybody thinks that for the majority, yes to both of them? Okay, good. That is the right answer from there. So let's see. Who is responsible for ensuring the subcontractors follow NIST 800-171 interim rule? That rule that came out last November. Is that a function of the accreditation body? Anybody think that? The subcontractor? The prime? Okay. The OSC, the organization seeking certification, or all of the above? We're going to have to discuss that one. We didn't see a lot of hands go up on that one, Dick. So, all right, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Hope everybody had a great lunch and is wide awake and ready to go. Hopefully we won't have to have people get up and do calisthenics or whatever to keep us going. So we had a lot of late people that came in. I want to see a show of hands again of how many people in the room are prime contractors. Okay. So the majority actually now. When we looked at this first, it was actually the small businesses. People showed up first, so great for the small businesses. All right. So one of the things I would just want to give a little introduction to in terms of being a prime contractor. I think most of the people in the room know the situation, but when you are the prime, you are responsible for that contract. And you are responsible for all the work that's being done on that contract, and you're responsible for all of your subcontractors that work on that contractor. And when it comes to cybersecurity, the big responsibility is adequately protecting sensitive information and what people call CUI, which is controlled unclassified information. And what I've been seeing in the last, I would say, 12 to 24 months is we're going to see as contractors in this AE business more and more CUI than we've had in the past because our agencies are worried about security, and they want to make sure that we protect that sensitive information, and that's our responsibility. So the other difference in doing federal contracting, right, is there are rules, right? I always tell people in my company that difference between commercial and federal is in commercial there's not all that many rules, but in federal contracting, I think most of us know there are these rules called the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So dating back quite a few years ago, I think one of the first rules that was implemented was 204.20, 52.20, 204.21, which is basic safeguarding, right? But the most recent, I found it back in a 2015 contract, which is 7012, which is the one we all have to worry about, right? So 7012 says that we all have to be cyber secure when we're handling the government's sensitive information, right? And 7012 itself doesn't say a whole lot, but what it does say is that you have to follow the Nist Guidelines, and that guideline is 800-171, right? So as prime contractors, we're responsible to make sure that our subcontractors meet those requirements, and those requirements flow down to our subcontractors. Everybody's heard the term flow downs, and that's what that means. And sometimes even if you sign a subcontract, you are required to be compliant with the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and these FARs will flow down to you. Okay, so as primes and as subcontractors, what do we have to do? So there's a 3-part process that I use, and the first one is assessment, right? Is to meet with our subcontractors and to talk to them, I send them a couple forms to fill out, and try to get a good feel for where they actually are in their process of being compliant with 800-171, right? And one of the best ways to do that is in 800-171. It talks about putting together a system security plan, and as we talked about earlier, Damon talked about a POEM, which is a plan of action, which is all the things you don't meet, and then with milestone, which is when you think you can meet those, right? And as primes, it's important for us to make sure we go through those POMs that we get from our subcontractors and see how our team is doing, right? And the second responsibility, in my opinion, is to help, right? Is to get with our subcontractors and look at where they're sitting and find out how we can help them. And as Damon talked about, there's some biggies, the ones we want to take care of first, to ensure that we're protecting the government's information, and try to work with our subcontractors to get that taken care of. So the best advice that I can give for most of the subcontractors in the room is to do your self-assessment, to go through that, figure out what your score is, and you do that on the SPAR site, that's the Supplier Performance Risk System, and then put your palm together and look at where you're at, and then discuss it with your prime, and sit down and try to figure out how fast you can be compliant. So one of the last things is really a reassessment or a constant monitoring. The intent is to get better, and that's the whole point of the palm, is you want to get better. And we know now with the new ruling, you'll have 180 days to get better and to work through some of those issues. I will tell you, you will, in all likelihood, need professional help. Even as a large prime, the company that I work for, Power Engineers, we're a large prime. We have to get help. And we have a group of cybersecurity people within our company, and we still have to go out there and get help. And there's lots of companies like Damon's that are out there that can help you figure out how to navigate through all of these rules. I think there's 110 of them.
Oh, it was about 1,200, actually.
Oh,
yeah.
Way more.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then
RPOs, registered provider organizations, yeah, that are part of the ecosystem. So, well, I'm actually going to do a whole section on that.
So what happens if we're not compliant, right? And Ed can talk about the legal ramifications of that, but in terms of contract work, as the prime, we are responsible for ensuring that our team is going to provide adequate protection to the Department of Defense, right? So we have to make a judgment, and which means we may not allow certain subcontractors to work on certain task orders because they're simply not ready. And if we get a task order that includes sensitive information or CUI, that they may be restricted from working on that contract work. So there can be implications. Some of them more severe than others. So in the end, the most important thing is to understand the requirements as they stand today. Even though CMC is on hold until CMMC-2 gets initiated, our contracts, most of our contracts as prime still include, the 70-12 requirement, which means we still have to be compliant with 800-171, CMMC or no CMMC. Try to say that 3 times. Try to say it even once. So anyway, I'll now turn it over to Ned, and Ned can talk about what those implications are if we're not, in fact, compliant.
Perfect. All right, a couple other questions here. Show of hands. What are the potential penalties for not scoring and submitting accurate NIST 171 results into SPURS, the Supplier Performance Risk System? No penalties until CMMC certification is fully adopted, right? So it hasn't been adopted yet. 2.0 has just been coming out, so we're in the rulemaking process on that. Anybody believe that? About 3 times the contract value plus some $23,677 per claim. Anybody? This is participation time, right? So, loss of contract, breach of contract litigation, criminal penalties. Loss of contract, okay. Yeah, all right. That'll give you something to talk about there. So, all right.
Great, well, thanks everybody again for coming by today. Really appreciate your time. Let me get the mic over here. So one of the things, the CMMC dynamic obviously has changed over the course of the last couple of weeks here to some extent, but it's also been affected to some extent by recent DOJ policy initiatives. So about a month ago, the Deputy Attorney General in testimony before Congress and then the department itself put out news releases indicating that the government is now intending to fully enforce cybersecurity requirements using the False Claims Act. So from a compliance perspective, you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, just in our work within the legal community, we've been working with clients over even the last year or two, small businesses, very large businesses, that have not realized, oh, well, what does NIST 800-171 mean? What do I have to do to get compliant with this? Even though the clause has been in their contracts for going on, 6 or 7 years at this point. So I think one of the key takeaways from both CMMC 2.0 and the DOJ initiative is that the government is trying to do two things. One, I think the government recognized, and obviously there's a number of government folks here that can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the government recognized CMMC 1.0 was to some extent not feasible and risked some participation in the defense industrial base by smaller companies, by companies that did not have large infrastructure that can support all of these requirements. So there was some degree of reasonableness that the government was attempting to add to the process. The flip side of that is that the government, we've seen here and there a False Claims Act case or two over the course of the last handful of years relating to cybersecurity issues, but there really has not been a significant amount of really forced government enforcement on cybersecurity issues. And given the pipeline attacks that have occurred recently with ransomware, the Chinese and Russian cyber attacks on government infrastructure, email, and the like, the government is now taking a much more significant posture in terms of enforcing those requirements. They're now saying, okay, you've had 5 or 6 years to comply with this. This is not new. We are going to view this as material to the government's ability to pay. And one of the questions up before was, what penalty can you have for misrepresenting your CMMC score in SPRS? We have heard indications that DOJ, if a contract was awarded as a result of or because of a cybersecurity certification like that, and that's one of the things in 2.0, with that certification being made at the officer level of companies, that is ripe for False Claims Act enforcement going forward here. And given that the contract would be based on that, there is a risk that the entire contract could be affected from a damages standpoint, particularly if there's a loss of government data. So that's kind of the dynamic I think that 2.0 has kind of brought into the community here, where it's a recognition of reasonableness and trying to ensure that everybody can comply with these provisions, while at the same time recognizing that time is of the essence to actually start complying with them. So with that in mind, as Dick was saying, there's a lot of issues that are raised in connection with the DFARS clause, now the 7012 clause and 800-171 and then CMMC. If you fail to comply with those requirements, they range from, obviously, as a general matter, from contractual disputes and claims with the government if you're a prime contractor, False Claims Act enforcement, as I just noticed, or as I just referenced, suspension and debarment if a company regularly has insufficient cybersecurity controls in place and they're required to under their contracts. We understand and expect that that'll be an area of increased vigilance by the SDOs here. And then from a subcontracting level, obviously there's disputes with your primes, risk loss of contracts at the subcontract level. And again, FCA liability flows up. So even if you're a subcontractor, if you have represented in SPRS, if you've represented to your prime contractor that you are compliant with these requirements here, there is a fairly significant government enforcement risk. So, one question that we regularly get, and this is from an 800-171, even before CMMC standpoint, is what happens if we don't comply with the 800-171 process? So, the government, obviously, given that the prime contractor is the one who holds the contract and, they're ultimately responsible to the government for enforcement action, that's the government's focus. At subcontract level, at a prime contractor level, you need to make sure, as Dick said, you need to be flowing down those requirements, asking your subcontractors the right questions, getting their SSPs and POEMs, and ensuring they at least start to have steps in place to ensure that they're compliant with these requirements here. In terms of actual, putting your scores in SPRS, determining how close you are to full compliance with 800-171, one thing that we think the government is going to be increasingly focused on is engaging with reliable, experienced providers who know what they're doing in terms of determining compliance with these controls. So if you're engaging a vendor to help you comply with NIST 800-171, to develop that SSP, to develop POEMs, is that vendor actually a vendor that knows what they're doing, or did you just go out and pick, a low-cost vendor that's going to tell you, yep, everything's okay, without actually doing any work? that's a big issue. I think that, these are, you'd be surprised how many smaller vendors will suggest that they have, a score of 110, 115 in SPURS when they have no IT infrastructure. That's actually not uncommon from what we've seen in engaging with some of our prime contractor clients. And things like that can certainly constitute misrepresentations that the government is going to be increasingly focused on a going forward basis. So one thing in CMMC that 2.0 has seemed to at least help us get away from, we've been getting a lot of questions of, well, shoot, what if we get certified under CMMC and we fall out of compliance? 1.0 was either you're compliant or you're not. Under 2.0, as Damon said earlier, there is an opportunity for POAMs for some number of the controls, not all of them obviously, but given that POAM requirement, we view that as a benefit to contractors at this time. Now that said, you need to be in a position to identify those issues that need to be POAM'd. You need to engage appropriate entities quickly to remediate those, and you need to report those to your government customers so that they're in the loop. If one of the biggest risk factors, at least that we've seen in recent years in issues like this, is entities not telling the government when they're non-compliant with the term. As a general matter, the government is far more likely to be lenient from an enforcement perspective if a contractor or subcontractor identifies a non-compliance, reports it, and remediates it in due course with the government's knowledge. They want to know what the cybersecurity standards are, and if they've not been met, if the contractor tells them that, they can plan accordingly, and the issue can be remediated. If the prime or the sub chooses not to report that, and there's an issue, that's something the government will certainly not look favorably upon. So on top of that, this has led, and I think will in the future certainly also lead to prime subcontractor disputes. Primes are going to be reliant upon their subs to be reporting accurate information, and as Dick said, to be protecting the government's CUI, CDI at the same levels and standards that a prime contractor is. The prime is, as we said before, directly responsible to the government for compliance with that requirement. So if there's a breach, if there's a loss of information, the government's going to come down hard on the prime. We've seen a number of instances where large military DoD-focused prime contractors are requiring their subs to be NIST compliant even if they don't receive CUI. Now, I wouldn't recommend that necessarily if I was a prime, and if I was a sub, I'd push back on that because it's not required unless you receive CUI. But at the same time, that's the level of diligence that a lot of the prime contractors that we've seen are attempting to put on subcontractors. And the flip side is we've seen a lot of subcontractors accept those terms knowing full well that they can't comply with them. That's an area that is ripe for risk both with the government and with your prime contractor. And from a dispute standpoint, that's something that the prime contractor is going to push up to the government and say, we required them to comply with this. They told us that we were compliant with this. If there's a loss of information, it is their fault, not ours. So if you have an issue with that, go seek enforcement from them. So again, sort of one of the things that we always recommend clients do is, engage with your prime contractor, submit that information on the front end, the SSP, the POAM, and continue to evaluate that and update that. Recognizing that some of these things are expensive, but at the same time, they are not necessarily as expensive as you may think they are, and it's a lot easier to address the issue on the front end than to have DOJ or an enforcement official on your doorstep on the back end. And with that, I guess I'll pass it over to Damon, subject to questions at the end here.
Thanks, Ned. All right, so a couple other, I think I've got one or two questions here again. So there's all kinds of TLAs up there, right? 3-letter acronyms from there. So let us know, which ones of those would be beneficial in helping organizations get to compliance? So RPOs, anybody know those? Never heard of them? RPs, I mentioned one. C3PAO, the C3PO. See some rolling eyes there. It's actually very difficult for me to pronounce that. C3PAO rolls off my tongue so well over the last year that I actually have to stop and say C3PO. Yeah, that's the Star Wars character. Or all the above, right? So actually the answer on that one is RPOs, RPs, C3POs, nothing to do with Star Wars from there. So, all right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about NIST 800-171, compliance with that, then lead into CMMC and with 2.0 on there. I'm also going to tell you a couple of the other differences that I purposely left out just because I didn't want to confuse things at the very beginning. So NIST 800-171, what did it take to be compliant? Well, when it was first introduced in 2016, it really was that you needed to have just the system security plan, an SSP, in place, and you could address things with a POAM, right? That was pretty much it. With SPRS and the interim rule that came out, now what's required is you still need to do that. So there's 110 control objectives that need to be followed. You need to perform that self-assessment based upon the DoD's methodology, right? So it's a total number of 110 points. You lose points for every one of those 110 controls you don't have in place. There's no coincidence that the highest number is 110, right? But you can't just subtract 1 point off for each one that you don't have. Some of them, as I alluded to earlier, have a higher penalty, from there. And so the lowest score, I think, is like minus 180, 182 or something like that, from there. So, if you're actually at a 20, 50, 70, where that wouldn't be a passing grade in school, it's actually, not terrible from there. But obviously, the closer we get to 110 is, was really what we're looking for. And then, of course, with the interim rule that came out effective November 30th of last year, the last piece that you had to do was basically give up your score, put it into supplier performance risk system, kind of like a credit score for your cybersecurity, right? And the idea behind that, if you look at the DFARS clauses, it also obligated the procurement officer, contracting officer to go and look at those and evaluate that as part of the overall awarding process from there. So realistically, if you had multiple entities, similar in all aspects, same pricing, quality, financial stability, all that kind of stuff, now we throw in where are you at from a cybersecurity standpoint as well from there. So that was NIST 800-171. With CMMC, I mentioned there's levels, right? And so one of the reasons some of the reasons why it wasn't very well adopted was the fact that if you look at the DIB, the majority of all companies don't deal with controlled unclassified information, right? They're at a maturity level 1. And yet, under NIST 800-171, they had to be compliant with it the same way as the largest, primes, the Raytheons, Lockheed Martins, those kind of companies, right? And if you've got a small little business, a 5-person engineering firm or a small manufacturing firm, it was, some of those controls could be considered egregious. There, but everybody was kind of weighted the same way. It also didn't matter what you were receiving, right? So if you had CUI or didn't have CUI, you still had to have the same controls in place. Truthfully, from the DoD standpoint, one of the problems is the self-assessment side of things. That we all kind of learned that in 3rd grade. That when you self-assess your own grading, papers, you tend to grade yourself a little bit higher, right? And that's why we had to pass it to our neighbor on that one. But if you look at it, when the vast majority of those entities really are at a maturity level 1. They're not dealing with controlled unclassified information. They need to have some basic things in place. The self-assessment, I think, is, as Ned said, a good balance between that, and I don't really have much of a problem, with that. With the level 2, like I said, so it's now NIST 800-171. It's based on NIST 800-171. One of the things that they also did with moving from 1.0 to 2.0 is they eliminated those extra DoD-specific controls. At maturity, at the old maturity level 3, right? So right in the middle there were 130 practices. The first 110 of those were in fact the NIST 800-171 controls. And then they added an additional 20 controls in there, okay? Those have been removed, at least for now, okay? And I'm saying this because I think you're likely gonna see some of those come back. And I think the way that you're going to see them come back is that NIST will modify NIST 800-171 with a new version of it, and all of those, maybe even more, will come into play. And because CMMC 2.0 is simply based on your adherence to NIST 800-171, whatever's in that framework, you're going to need to have in place, right? So I don't know that I would necessarily run out there and go, yeah, we just lost 20 of the controls. From a volume standpoint, it's about 18% of the controls, but realistically, from a effort standpoint, it's probably about 5%. Right? If you already had the 110 controls in place, it didn't take much to go that extra 20 controls there, okay? One of the other significant changes, at least on paper, when you look at 2.0, is the fact that they also removed the maturity processes. Under the version 1, there were maturity processes, basically written documentation, right? So you had to have written policies, written procedures, and a written plan at level 3. Those maturity processes have been removed. However, you're still going to need to have them in place because it's hard to put in a practice if you don't have the policies and the procedures to handle that. The DoD has actually made it very clear that, in fact, you are going to need to have those policies and procedures. The difference is that they're not going to be assessed like they were under version 1.0. I think that's a good thing. Basically what it does is it removes that issue where maybe every I and every T, every I wasn't dotted, every T wasn't crossed, and you missed one little thing, and now you're failing that control because this is what your policies say you do, but in reality you're doing something else. If you're close, you're going to be fine with that. And I think that's a good change on that one from there. I already mentioned the idea about the POAMs. Here's the caution on that one, if you think about it. Under the original CMMC 1.0, it was kind of all or nothing. You either had the controls in place or you didn't. However, at that point in time when the C3PAO came in to evaluate you, if there were controls that you didn't have in place, you had a 90-day window, a cure period to get those in place. Okay, so now you have a 180-day one, but we call it a POAM. Right? It was still there, it just was kind of disguised a little bit differently from there. So you do have that POAM, like I said, it's time-bound, 180 days, it's you got to qualify for it, 50, 60 score, I'm thinking, and some of the items aren't going to be addressable from there. The process hasn't changed at all in terms of becoming certified, with the exception of if you're at a maturity level 1 or a non-prioritized contract, then it's a self-attestation. It's probably going to be done through the SPURS process, very similar to what it's done right now. But if you are actually going out there for the certification, it is a 3-year certification. To start the process, you go out to the accreditation body, so CMMC-AB.org, CMMC accreditation body. You go out to there and you register on that site as a OSC, as an organization seeking certification. All right, that's how you basically let the board know, okay, yep, we're interested in becoming certified. Part of the contract between the DoD and the CMMC accreditation body was this idea that they create an entire ecosystem out there, an ecosystem of people who can do the training, providers of the actual published material on it, companies that are out there to help assist organizations becoming compliant, and then a marketplace for the actual audits, the C3PAOs. The CMMC accreditation body has done a very good job on setting up that ecosystem. I mentioned, there was a question earlier. I think Jeff had asked the question, where did the number 1,200 come from? Last I had checked, there were about 1,200 companies that had registered to become an RPO, a registered provider organization, which means that they have to employ registered practitioners or align themselves with registered practitioners. Those individuals have to go through additional training specific to the CMMC framework, and pass a test and that kind of stuff. So they're basically the consulting arm of the accreditation body's ecosystem, completely independent of, but just, they're part of that. Last count, there's probably about 400, just a little north of 400 C3PAOs that are going through that process, as well. And those are the side of the organization that actually performs that certification, performs the assessment. They actually, in turn their work papers over to the accreditation body, who does a quality assurance test on it, and then actually is the one that issues the certification. As I mentioned, the certification is good for 3 years. If you are in that level 2, bifurcated, and you're a non-prioritized, all right, you don't have to go through the C3PAO process, you'll be an annual attestation, whereas if you're certified, it's a 3-year. Here's the interesting thing about that if you think about this, though, too. The designation as to whether it's prioritized or non-prioritized is at the contract level, okay, not at the organization level. So if you've got 5 contracts, 4 of which are non-prioritized, but one of them that you want to be awarded is a prioritized contract, you're still going to have to go through the process of becoming certified with the C3PAO, okay, on that one. So when you look at all the changes that are out there, the reality of it is, for most of you in this group, maybe all of you in this group, I don't think things really change that much for you from version 1 to 2. Sure, we're calling some things a little bit different. We've collapsed the model. You're now probably going to be at a level 2, at a level 2. You're still going to probably have to go through the C3PAO process. Even though you're not being assessed on the policies and procedures, you're probably going to need those policies and procedures. Even though they've removed the 20, extra controls, chances are we're going to see them again. So basically what I'm saying is stay the course, right? Do what you were already starting to do with under 1.0, because for the most part, everything is still the same. And if you're shooting up here to get it to the place where you can pass a C3PAO's exam, then you're going to be ready for it just in general. How many of you have gone through what I'm going to say is an evidence-based assessment in the past? Okay, a small handful. All right. Here's the biggest thing that I have seen over the last 4 or 5 years going through NIST 800-171. I'll ask a second question, a follow-on question. How many have read the standard? How many have read or picked up and looked at some of the controls? Okay, good. Yeah. How many of you understood them perfectly? Yeah. So part of the reason for that is they're written in such a way to be as broad-based as they possibly can, because they have to address a lot of different organizations, right? It is a framework that we call non-prescriptive, meaning that it doesn't tell you, it tells you what you need to do, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. That's good and bad. The good part of it is it recognizes that for your organization, what might work for you might be completely different than somebody else's organization. And it gives you that flexibility. It gives you that flexibility to run your business and not be, hindered by the controls. The bad part of it is it leaves it up for interpretation, right? And so when I look at those controls, having done this for more than 20 years, I look and I go, oh yeah, I know exactly what that means. A lot of times we get people look at that and going, hey, I have no idea what that means. Now, a little word of caution, if you get to one of those things and you say, I have no idea what that means, the right answer for your self-assessment shouldn't be, oh yeah, then we probably have that in place. But yet that's what happens over and over again. People look at it and go, I have no idea what that means. Yep, we're compliant with it, right? Hence why we've got the problem from there. So part of it is just understanding what those controls are and understanding what it is that can actually remediate and address that issue from there. Again, the nice part about that is there's a lot of resources out there for you, some of which are part of the accreditation body ecosystem, right? So the RPOs, C3POs. By the way, there is no restriction against a C3PAO assisting a client in becoming compliant. Just can't do that for the same company that they're going to be auditing, right? So as a C3PAO, you can go out there and help companies become compliant. Just if you've done that, you can't audit them, right? Because it would be a conflict of interest. So RPOs, C3POs within the ecosystem, those are your friends in terms of helping you to do it. They've had special training on the framework from there. The good news also is that you don't need to use anybody for that. You are absolutely able to do this on your own if you've got an outside IT company, a cybersecurity company that understands the framework well enough. If you've got your internal staff that understands it from a compliance side of things, you can absolutely do that. The only thing you need to have anybody from the CMMC-AB from is if you have one of those prioritized contracts and you're trying to become certified, then you have to hire a C3PAO. But otherwise, you can do this on your own from there. Now, the reason I ask about the evidence-based assessment, if you've not gone through the evidence-based assessment, I kind of want to walk through what that kind of looks like, right? So one of the things that you need to understand is what is the purpose of an audit? It is to have somebody externally come in and look at the environment and look at it close enough with enough critique on it to be able to opine on whether you have those controls in place or not, so that they can attest to somebody else, in this case, the accreditation body and the DoD, to say, yeah, you've got these things in place, okay? Now imagine if you're one of those C3PAOs, you've given the blessing to company A, and 6 months after company A has been blessed, they have a compromise. Who do you think the DoD is going to be looking at? They're going to be looking at the OSC, the organization seeking certification. They're also going to be looking at the C3PAO going, what gives? How did you give them a positive on this, right? So the goal of an audit is to go in there and make sure that the goal of the auditor is to never put themselves in a position where they're going to have to defend that. And the way that they do that is by collecting all kinds of evidence about the fact that you have those controls in place, right? Ticking and tying their work papers. The guidance that we generally give to our auditors is that you need to collect enough information so that somebody who doesn't have the ability to talk to the organization seeking certification, who doesn't have the ability to go in and test, who doesn't have the ability to collect any other evidence, can read your work papers and still come to the same conclusion, okay? So going through one of these assessments, that's what's going to happen is the C3PO is going to take a look at every single one of those controls, 110 controls at level 2, and they're going to look to see, are you executing on that, and do you have evidence? And the evidence that they can use is interviews, so they can talk to the person who carries out that work. They can do direct observation, meaning look at what you're doing and watch you do some process, or they can test it. And in fact, the guidance to the C3PAOs is they need to collect 2 pieces of corroborating evidence, and they have to come from different areas. So you can't do 2 interviews. You can do an interview and a testing, or interview and observation, but you can't just do, there. So the short of that is it's serious, right? It's relatively, difficult to, get through these things. Most of the time, most organizations have the practices in place. They're doing something. They may not have the policies and procedures in place, but where they really fall down on is the ability to produce that evidence, right? And so one of the things that I strongly encourage you to do is if you haven't gone out and looked at the standard, go out there, look at it, collect it, get a good understanding of what they're really asking for that. Design a control that meets the objective, and as you're doing that, you want to think about what is it that we're going to need to be able to show as evidence to be able to get the C3PAO satisfied that that thing is in place. And as a good example, some of the requirements are, that you regularly review logs, right? Well, okay, so great, I get a log file, I look at it, right? Well, how do you prove that you actually did that? There's ways, right? Even if it's somebody just manually signing off on it or an email or something, but you need to collect that because at that point in time, the CMMC or the C3PAO is going to want to see that kind of thing from there. So, all right. And the last thing is, once you understand the framework, you understand what's going to be in place in terms of the controls and what evidence if there's any gaps out there, you want to remediate those. Because realistically, by the time you get to that place where you either have to self-attest or bring the C3PAO in there, you want to know that you already have everything in place because you only have 180 days to get it rectified from that. So stay the course. That's my big thing on that one. So with that, we're going to open it up, answer any questions you guys might have. And from there, I definitely invite those. Again, if you can speak up, I'll repeat the questions if you don't. Yep.
larger firms that have multiple offices, are you having to submit scores for each office, or do you just submit one score for the company?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to paraphrase that. With the supplier performance risk system, with SPRS, you have to submit your score. For larger entities that might have multiple locations, maybe even multiple cage codes, things along that lines, do you submit one or do you submit multiple? So, do you? I know, but I didn't know if you had a.
So I can tell you, Power Engineers being a large firm, in our top 40, we only have one score, but we only have one, what's the term you just used?
Cage code.
One cage code. So I believe you'll have to have at least one for each cage code.
Yep.
For your
So
company.
do you handle all of your information on federal projects through that one cage code? Because, I mean, if you've got people spread out all over your company and you're handling information, I mean, does it have to kind of go through that one cage code?
It does.
Yep. So, yeah, exactly what Dick said there in terms of you got to have one for every cage code. You can register an HLO, a higher level organization that combines them all. The bigger problem isn't so much the logistics of getting the scores in. It's exactly what you alluded to there, which is how do you segregate that? You know, and yeah, a lot of the organizations, that's what they're going to do is they're going to run it through just one cage code. But even within one cage code, you might have multiple locations, that kind of stuff. So the concept of an enclave for your data really does, in some circumstances, makes some sense. Here's the big thing you need to remember is that CMMC is there to protect the data. It doesn't dictate what systems you need to have. It dictates what things and what controls you need to have in place to protect that data. So wherever that data exists, that's where you're going to need to have those controls and apply them against it. So the counterpoint to that is if we can combine that and get that all into one location, an enclave, and put all those controls around that, in some organizations that may make sense.
So I got just a follow on that, which may be helpful or not, which is when you're doing when we're doing our system security plan, it's being done for the entire company, regardless of what office it's in, right? We want to make sure every office meets those requirements. The two things to be careful about and worry about is a lot of larger firms like ourselves will do acquisitions from time to time. So now you have to make sure that acquisition meets all of those same requirements, and it can be a fair amount of work. The other thing that we're dealing with now, which really kind of throws a tough dart at us, is the work from home environment, right? Because you still have to meet all those requirements with your employees that are working from home, and that can make things difficult. Right? As example, one of the requirements, I think it's 313.7 that talks about, we talked about this last night, the tunneling, that can really slow your system down when you have a work from home environment. So you got to evaluate, how do I fix that? How do I do that? How do I stay productive and make money as a company, but at the same time meet all the requirements of 800.171. So.
But there are also a half a dozen technical ways to solve that problem, right? So you just have to be ready to do that.
Yeah. So far, we haven't found one that speeds us up. They all keep slowing us down. That's the problem. but there are ways you can get around that. Yep.
And look, I'll echo Dick from an acquisition perspective. We do M&A work at our firm, and in terms of acquiring entities that do work with DoD, the first question that should be asked, or one of the first questions that should be asked in connection with every one of those acquisitions is, can you give me a copy of your SSP and your POM in place if your contracts include the 7012 clause or any of the relevant provisions here? Because if there is no SSP in place, and the company is receiving CDI or CUI or a substantial amount of it in particular, that can be a very expensive process to go through to integrate that company into the company's broader SSP.
I have two questions, if I may. First is the legal question. If you're a prime or a sub that has subs under you, do you think if you put in your contractor general terms and conditions a hold harmless provision, that if there is a breach of that particular requirement or obligation, that they would hold you harmless? And number two, on that, they would be covered by any loss by their insurance?
It's It's a good question. The question, there's two of them. One is if there's a hold harmless provision that's in a lower tier subcontract, would that be sufficient to indemnify the higher tier subcontractor or prime contractor from a liability standpoint? And the second question was, is it possible for a subcontractor's insurance to address that same issue? I'll handle the first one first, I guess. So from a government liability perspective, no, it wouldn't be sufficient. I mean, if there were monetary damages that as a prime contractor, if the government came after you for something that your subcontractor did, you certainly could hold your subcontractor liable, either under a hold harmless clause or even broadly as a breach of contract. If they've repped to compliance with 800-171, that's a breach of contract claim, and you should be able to, depending on the damages provisions that are in the contract, seek redress for that. In terms of insurance, yes, we have seen insurers provide coverage for things like this. It can get expensive fairly quickly, but it is something that if you've got the right insurance policies in place, you can, from a monetary damages standpoint, you can be indemnified. Now that doesn't, again, address the risks of suspension and debarment, for example. The False Claims Act penalties can get very high very quickly, and there's often caps on policies and things like that. But at least from a pure damages perspective, if all things considered, it is a mechanism to reduce risk, but it would not necessarily eliminate it. How about that?
My second question is, if you have a joint venture and say two parties,
Yep.
one necessarily is the managing member,
Yep.
and that joint venture is unpopular,
Yep.
so all work flows to the members
Yep.
thereafter, and you're submitting a proposal in by the JV. Does the JV, it's unpopulated, it's not going to do any work, but it'll have a contract.
Yep.
Does that have to go through this process and attest its compliance? That's number one. And number two, with the two members also have to go through the process, and do they have to report it up through?
It's a very good question again. So the question is, from a JV perspective, if the JV is unpopulated, does the JV have to attest and go through the process? And then two, each of the member companies also have to do the same thing? From a legal perspective, and frankly, Damon, I appreciate your guidance on this too. For an unpopulated JV, if it holds the contract, in theory, it would have to go through the process. Now, if it's unpopulated, it doesn't use its own systems, it would almost necessarily have to flow down to the member companies that are performing the actual work. So, I think it would have to attest to it, and then the performing entities certainly would have to be either certified or make the attestation. Frankly, anyone down the chain, be it the operating companies that are the member companies, and then any subcontractor they're under, would need to either have the certification if it's level 2 or level 3, or make the attestation if it's level 1 or the not required level 2.
The managing member is, because there's no system in the would it use the information from the managing partner and just repeat it and submit it?
So the question on that one was, continuation of it was basically if it's unpopulated, would you use the information from the managing partner on that? Again, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier is it really depends on where the information is being stored, right? So if the data is not in the managing partner, but all at the other one, because that's just the arrangement, then it would be the other one that would be where you generate the attestation or the certification, from there. For the unpopulated entity, really that would be a perfect use of the HLO, the higher level organization, where you're tying those two or however many ventures into it, from there. So you could submit it, but you'd still have to, again, it goes back to where is the data.
Yeah. It is a system-based certification. It follows the CUI. It's not any system that's working under the contract. It's just systems in which CUI or CDI is stored. So it does follow the data to that regard.
The contract won't be awarded to JV.
Correct.
Yep.
Unless it puts its information in that system. It says you will not be awarded, even if you prevail. And so if the JV then says,
Yeah, it's a great question that it really has not, I think, been adequately worked out so far. It's a very good question.
So, but it does give me fodder for, so I attend some pretty regular town hall meetings with the accreditation body, and we get to ask questions like that and throw it at them, and then hear them say the same thing, which is, that's a really good question. We'll get back to you on that one, so I'm going to put that one down. So,
Thank you, I'm sorry.
yeah, no problem.
I think you may have touched on this a little bit earlier, but if a save and hold harm, at me as a prime, if a save and hold harmless to my sub does not protect me from, from their problems, what do you recommend, or how would you say I get into their business to assure myself they're doing, assuring me correctly?
So from an SSP standpoint, let me repeat the question first. So the question was, from a hold harmless standpoint, what if a hold harmless provision is insufficient to fully mitigate the risk of, from a prime contractor standpoint, what can a prime do to ensure compliance with these particular types of clauses without getting into the business of the subcontractor? And I think what Dick had said earlier, what his company does, and I've seen other clients of ours do the same thing. So it's you ask the sub for a copy of their SSP. You ask the sub for a copy of their POAM, and you follow up on that on a fairly regular basis to ensure that they're compliant with that. You don't have to do a full-scale audit of the SSP or the POAM, but to ensure that type of documentation is in place, to ensure that they're making progress on their POAM, that's a fairly reasonable, I think, way to go about doing that. If subs aren't willing to share that information with the prime, I've seen that before. Asking the question, but then asking them to represent and certify that, no, we have an SSP in place. There are, X number of POAMs. We are actively working to mitigate those POAMs. The more that you can get from the sub to demonstrate their understanding of the requirements and that they're attempting to follow them. The government doesn't expect you to do full audits of your subs in any way, shape, or form. But at the same time, I think with the changes here and with the natural flow down of a clause like this that follows the data, there is an expectation that you're taking some steps to ensure that CUI, CDI is protected as it's flowed down to the lower tier subcontractors.
So there's another piece there too that I think will be helpful, and that is having nothing to do with what we just talked about. There's also reputational risk,
Yeah.
right? And there's also your CPAR ratings, right? And the fact that your client knows that you breached their data, right? So the big risk can be not being awarded future work because you have a low CPARs rating, right? Or you have this reputational risk thing. Even if the hold harmless got you out of financial trouble, there's still those other elements that you have to be careful of.
And a suspension and debarment risk too. I mean, this is something we have heard rumblings that folks at IG's offices are actually hiring experts that understand some of these cybersecurity requirements, and they are, this is going to be, I think, an area that's ripe for enforcement and investigative action over the course of the next couple of years, particularly if and when there's data breaches.
Can I just comment on this real quick, if you wouldn't mind? So, my name is Jeff Stutzman, and from 2009 to 12, I was the DICE director that built the back end of this. And to the questions about the JVs and subcontractors, on the government side of this, it doesn't matter how you slice this, right? If there's a breach, it was my old shop that would make the referrals to law enforcement.
Yeah.
And it won't stop
Yep.
chasing where they think the breach came from or who was at fault.
Yep.
So that's kind of the bottom line in this, right? 800-171 was put together, I was involved in the process, it was put together for two things. Number one is to give everybody a baseline by which we could go out and investigate a breach.
Yep.
And number two was just to bring everybody up. It was a very risk-based approach to the way that we structured this, right? Firewalls, endpoints, auditability, training, constant reminders, right? Those are the things that 800-171 did.
Yep.
So, but to the JV questions and the subcontractors, if you're being investigated by Air Force OSI or whoever it is, they don't care how the paperwork is written.
True.
Question. Robert Baker, Department of Systems. Prior to November 2019, there was a push for DCMA to go out and do audits for certain companies. Now, we went through that audit, but the issue that I'm having is finding out what our score is going to be at the CMMC level, and DMCA doesn't understand what our score is going to subcontractor, what have you heard about that, or what the current state of that scoring versus what a CMMC score will?
Yeah. So question basically, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I think it goes to a bigger issue, which is what if you have a previous certification in something else, ISO 27001. In your case, you went through the DCMA assessment on that. There is some talk in the DoD about having some kind of reciprocity for those, but it is not. It's being kicked down the road. I don't have a good answer for you other than that they are aware of that situation, and they're probably. My guess, kind of reading and listening to what the DoD has been saying on it, there probably will be something, but they're not at a place where they're ready to, announce that yet. So the answer to it would be that they're going to make you go through the process again. That you would have to go through it and do your self-assessment, or if you're prioritized, have a C3PAO assessment performed. From there. One thing, as Jeff was saying, and something, Dick, as you were saying it, and I usually say it a little bit earlier in the thing, is while these controls in some situations may seem like they're kind of a little bit overbearing in that, the reality of it is to Jeff's point, is this is kind of a baseline. And quite frankly, these are the kinds of things, having been in the industry for 20 plus years, these are the kind of things that really you should just have in place for your own protection, for your own, your own financial information, your own data, so you don't run into having a ransomware attack, and that kind of stuff. Now, you're not going to eliminate 100% of it, never can, but the more and more of these things you can put in place, the less likely you're going to have an issue, and if you do have an issue, you're going to notice it earlier so that you can do something about it from there. So, two things you can take away from, at least from my standpoint, is stay the course with CMMC and do it because it's just good business. Then you start entering the other things in place, and it really makes a lot of sense from there. Any other questions? Yep.
Hi, Brian Myers from Michael Baker. This is kind of more of a business development sort of question. So as we're forming teams with subcontractors to chase after an IDIQ that could have complex or non-complex, or prioritized or non-prioritized, will our subcontractors have to hold the same level, say a level 2, to work on that at a task order level, or are they covered, just having any certification would be good enough to include them on the team? The second part of that question is, if they are required to match, could that adversely affect subcontracting goals?
Dick, you want to try that one?
Yeah, so I'll try to field that one. That's a really good question. So the issue that he's talking about is on most of the contracts that we win as prime contractor, they're IDIQs, right, and they have task orders. So there's a couple of things there. When you're evaluating your team, I think it's absolutely appropriate to ask your team what is your score, right? So you can figure out which subcontractors you can use on which task orders and which subcontractors you can't, right? Right. The other thing that I think is going to happen, and I'm making a prediction here, is that we're going to start seeing more CUI than we used to, right? And that is because of just the being scared of what can happen with all the hacks and breaches, is more information is going to be secure. Think of something as simple as a site plan for a base, right? Think of what's on that site plan. If you're just doing simple road remodel or fixing a driveway, on that site plan, there could be location of substations and location of ops buildings. And so sooner or later, that may actually be determined sensitive information, and you may have to be able to protect that. So what you might have thought was not CUI in the past, we may see a CUI in the future. Now, there could be task orders that are very simple, replace roofs or whatever, and that there really is not going to be any CUI, and you could, in my opinion, get by with a subcontractor that has a Tier 1 rating because he's simply not going to be exposed to anything. The other thing to keep in mind is you'll never know when you get a task order where all of a sudden there is CUI, or you get halfway through the task order and all of a sudden the government gives you some information and it turns out it's CUI, right? Now everybody that's exposed to that is going to have to be compliant. And it could happen at any time, and it's happened to us.
And from my perspective, I mean, it's a risk analysis. So, if there's zero chance that you will be giving your subcontractor CUI, there may be an opportunity for, as Dick said, a tier 1 subcontractor to be used under a level 2 contract, notwithstanding the fact that they're not level 2 certified. But you need to be pretty darn sure that what you're giving them does not constitute CUI, because if you do, you're then out of compliance with that provision. And one thing Dick said there that was, have our own experience on that's just incredibly interesting, that we were helping a client through the development of an SSP that had been a very large company, DoD contractor, didn't have an SSP in place, notwithstanding the fact that it had been 4 or 5 years since implementation of the clause. And we went to the contracting officer and asked, because the government had never identified CUI under the contract, and said, well, we understand the clause applies here. We understand that we're receiving CUI, but can you identify what that CUI is so we can know which systems have to be protected to the level that's required under 800-171? And the contracting officer's response was, I'm treating everything under this contract as CUI unless you can convince me otherwise. Even though there was data that clearly did not constitute CUI, CDI that was being provided under the contract. So I certainly echo Dick that the government is taking a very broad application of what that term is. If you look at the definition, NARA maintains the definitions of CUI, and each of those categories is exceptionally broad, and you can pigeonhole a lot of things into those categories. So I think you are going to see contracting folks who, frankly, I think want to make sure that they're protected. They don't want to go out on the hook and say, oh, this isn't CUI, have a breach, have that be exposed, have it actually be sensitive data, and then they're on the hook for that loss. I think you're going to see a lot of contracting folks say, no, it looks like everything under this, absent a good reason otherwise, constitutes CUI.
All right, well, we are right at that time, so I know I'll speak for the panel. We will stay up here if people have some individual questions, that kind of stuff. And from there, contact information is up there. Feel free to reach out to any of us as well. I think we'll all be happy to handle any kind of questions in that. So, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.